And that's kind of a précis of some stuff I had planned to develop at greater length. I'm teaching a course in the May term at Westminster on civil disobedience and Popich, so that's just kind of a glimmer without the text and detail. Anyway.
Thank you, Mike.
Okay. When I was asked to speak on this panel a few days ago, I looked at the questions, and I've been looking them over for the last 2 or 3 days, and I just wanted to share some thoughts on the questions that were posed. What counts as civil disobedience, and when is it justified? So I just kind of wrote up some of my thoughts, but I'll definitely be here to answer any kind of more informal questions after. I would like to start off by mentioning that I approach these larger issues, what counts as civil disobedience, and when is it justified, using multiple perspectives. I am a sociology professor, I teach gender studies, and I have my own personal opinions. In essence, I wear these 3 different hats. As I have been thinking about these larger questions presented here today, the tensions between each of my hats has become apparent. First off, I asked myself these questions from a sociological perspective. I quickly found that I could not answer the question as it was phrased. The discipline of sociology cannot and does not answer moral questions, cannot answer questions of good or bad, right or wrong. We can only observe what is, not what ought to be. Furthermore, sociology does not very often study the individual. Instead, human behavior is understood at the group or aggregate level. Civil disobedience often occurs at the individual level. So what impact might sociology have on these questions? Because sociologists look for patterns among people, some of these patterns could be noted. Social movements, which would include civil disobedience and other types of social action, are the focus of study or inquiry. We do know that social movements today have some group and organizational characteristics. First of all, most social movements in the United States today are made up of middle and upper class people. Also, most social movements today, excluding the women's movement, are led by men and their leadership is primarily male. Finally, social movements of today are concerned with matters of environmental and social justice, in contrast to earlier social movements which focused on labor and suffrage. Another point. Although the sociological perspective cannot ask or answer moral questions, the findings from social science research can spark debate and protest. Sociology deals with things that are measurable and observable. For instance, sociologists note that the distribution of wealth in the U.S. is very unequal. All families in the bottom 40% of the population own less than 1% of this nation's wealth. In contrast, families at the top 1% of the population own 40% of the nation's wealth. These findings can lead us to ask questions about the morality of our economic and social systems. In short, sociology cannot answer whether or not civil disobedience is justified. However, the discipline can supply the data or the findings that might support acts of civil disobedience. Switching hats, I now move to the gender studies perspective on civil disobedience. First of all, I need to point out that feminism is a diverse theoretical perspectives. It comes in many flavors. For the discussion today, I'm going to oversimplify a bit and distinguish between 2 broad types of feminism. Both types of feminism are concerned with equality between men and women. The question is, how are we going to get there? The first type is liberal feminism, which generally seeks equality through legal means, equal pay, lack of harassment in the workplace, reproductive freedoms, although we know that each of these hasn't always been sought through legal means. In contrast, radical feminism believes that our social institutions are shaped by a patriarchal history that needs to be dismantled rather than repaired. People who identify with the ideas of radical feminism may be more likely to practice civil disobedience. I guess the larger question is whether or not you can achieve your means legally versus illegally. The women's movement has been moved along by both types of social expression, legal channels and by acts of civil disobedience. Both means continue to be important in bringing about change in gender equality. So what are my own personal thoughts on social disobedience? It varies from case to case, like I saw with each of you raising your hand. Oh, I agree with that, not with that. Sometimes as I am reading the newspaper, watching CNN, or listening to NPR, I silently, or not so silently, applaud the actions of those who resist and challenge unjust systems. The question becomes, what is just? What is unjust? Sometimes legal means are not sufficient, and acts of civil disobedience are both just and moral. Thank you.
Okay, I remember when I was in I don't remember the exact year, but at some point in elementary school, for the first time I heard the whole question of, if a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to hear it, did it really make a sound? And I guess in preparing for this, talking with you today, I think the question that I keep coming back to is, if an act of violence occurs and no one complains about it, did it really occur? Because I guess the answer, and I wonder if your answer to that question changes based on the type of violence. Because we live in a country where, according to the Harvard Medical School, 45,000 people die each year because they don't have health insurance. 2/3 of the uninsured are either under the poverty level or really close to under the poverty level. And, people living, low-income Americans have less access to credit. And so when you talk about who's dying because they can't afford health care, middle-class people go bankrupt when they can't afford health care, poor people die. And so is it an act of violence when the 45,000 of your fellow citizens die because they can't afford health care? Is that an act of violence? I think that's sort of where I wanted to start off. I work at Crossroads Urban Center, which when it was set up in 1966, was a mission institution of the United Methodist Church. We've since worked to expand and first be ecumenical and then interfaith. And at this, but we still are a Methodist mission institution. And so I think, the whole question of how the work we do relates to the Judeo-Christian tradition is something that it was good for me to think about, because you do stuff, you don't always think about why you're doing it. Crossroads Urban Center, for those of you who don't know, runs the busiest food pantry in the state of Utah. We're located about a couple blocks from here on 4th East, between 3rd and 4th South. We also have a thrift store, which we had a discussion a couple years ago about whether we should rename it, because we give away 11 clothing items for every one item that we sell on a referral basis. And so, we primarily give clothing at our thrift store to people who wouldn't have it otherwise. That's what our thrift store is there for. We also have a food co-op that we set up a few years ago with the hope that by helping people to buy food in bulk and distribute it through volunteer labor, we could bring down the price of fresh fruits and vegetables and frozen meat for people who were coming to our pantry and really couldn't afford those things at the grocery store. There are now, I think, 13,000 people who joined that food co-op since it was set up about 3 years ago. But at the same time, so we have a variety of direct services we provide to low-income people. But from the day that Crossroads was set up, we also had this idea that we could not, it wasn't good to simply provide services to the poor if at the same time we were consenting to unjust policies that made them poor. And didn't just make them poor, but made them suffer